How wonderful, what a joy it is to be back here to tell you this story. The Notre-Dame Cathedral of Paris, the most iconic church in the world. A church full of stories, an incredible church. Maybe I would say one of my favorites, if not my favorite. It almost disappeared, but it received donations, the equivalent of 5 billion reais. And now, 5 years later, it's practically ready. I know you're thinking, but it's still full of scaffolding. There are cranes around it. Yeah, but it's nearly ready. You can't imagine how much work went into it over the past 5 years. And in December, if everything goes well, on December 8th, the cathedral will be open to the public again, just in time for Christmas. And look how beautiful it is. Even the spire, that pointed structure, which as the name suggests is the highest part of the church, is already in place. It's already back. Well, actually it's not back because it was completely rebuilt. Do you remember what it was like on the day of the fire?
What a sad scene, right?
The whole world watched as it was being destroyed and falling in flames. It's back, it's practically a new pinnacle, and up there is already the little rooster that's always been there, the golden rooster, which is one of the symbols of France. It's been 5 years since this architectural marvel, this marvel of religious art, if you will, almost disappeared. It was a tragedy, a shock for everyone who watched it live and on television, a shock for the French, and also a shock for Brazilians who come here a lot. People are arriving all the time, they just keep coming. And to think that Notre-Dame almost disappeared because of a series of mistakes. And it was by a very narrow margin that the firefighters managed to save it.
It was Monday of Easter week 6/18 in the afternoon, and Reverend Jean-Pierre Cavot was celebrating Mass for hundreds of worshippers and tourists, when an alert went off on the fire brigade's control panel. Due to a limitation in the alarm system's design, it wasn't possible to know immediately what was happening, whether it was a fire or where it was. It was necessary to walk up 6 flights of stairs and check the location indicated on the panel in person. The guard on duty, who had been hired 3 days earlier, left the church nave where he was and responded to the call. He found nothing and returned.
And to think that 30 precious minutes were lost before it was discovered that the newly hired guard had gone to look for the fire in the wrong place. He went to the other side. The fire actually was up in the attic up there, the place known as the forest. But only after the flames were already spreading did they realize that the fire was in the forest. A place called that because it had many oaks, many centuries-old trees, which were already centuries old back when it was built. And they were used, as they still are today, for what's called carpentry, as they say here in France, the church's framework. Later it was found out that the guard had gone to the other attic, the one above the sacristy, where there was no sign of fire, nothing. And then the second mistake happened. Just imagine, instead of calling the emergency number for the fire department, the police, to mobilize Paris's emergency services, the rookie guard decided to call his boss. So what did the boss do? Nothing. He didn't answer. He took a long time to answer. When he finally answered, after hearing the rookie guard's explanation, the boss said that something serious was happening and finally sent the rookie to the right place. And then they discovered that Notre Dame was on fire. An investigation by the American newspaper, the New York Times, concluded that the administrators of Notre Dame Cathedral made a series of mistakes over the past few years, especially regarding security. For example, they failed to install sprinklers at the top of the church, right up there, exactly where the fire started, because they wanted to preserve the original architecture. And besides not having the emergency sprinklers that could have saved the cathedral at that moment, the system that was developed over 6 years was so complicated, but so complicated that it hindered those who could have helped at that moment. The cathedral's security staff had a large panel in front of them. But instead of showing up there, for example, saying fire on the screen, strange codes appeared like this one here. For example, ZDA 110-110 315-1. The firefighter had to know what that meant to respond to this code, or he had to look it up in a catalog, something impossible, unimaginable, and completely senseless. And that made things much harder, giving the fire more time to consume the cathedral.
When the rookie guard finally went to the right place and climbed the 300 narrow steps leading to the main roof, he couldn't get in anymore. That's how intense the heat from the fire was. After all, there were hundreds of wooden beams that had been in the same place for centuries, completely dry without a drop of moisture. According to the New York Times investigation, it was mostly a mistake. The French administrators didn't believe that such old oak beams would burn so quickly.
After the tragedy, that's when the correct explanation finally appeared. Old wood, the kind that's 200, 300, 400, 500, or even 600 years old, does take a little longer to burn than new wood, but that doesn't mean the fire can't spread quickly. On the contrary, that's exactly what happened. And those who looked closely at the case said the real surprise wasn't the fire itself. The real surprise was that the fire hadn't happened sooner.
There's a certain unfairness in that last comment. After all, Notre-Dame has caught fire before. It was partially destroyed during the French Revolution, and it had to be almost completely rebuilt. In fact, destruction is part of the cathedral's identity. Yeah, it's strange, isn't it?
But after all,
the first church that existed there, in Romanesque style, was demolished to make way for the Gothic-style cathedral, and the stones were reused. The cause of the last fire has not been discovered to this day. The two main suspicions are a discarded cigarette butt or a short circuit. To get an idea of the size and quantity of the wooden beams, just look at these images of the carpenters who are working on the renovation. The structure is being rebuilt with new oak beams taken from more than 1,000 trees, following the same design and using the same tools as in medieval times. It was almost 7 o'clock in the evening that Monday. With so many failures in the system and in communication, it was now a race against the clock. Only 30 minutes after the first alert, the brigade was called and about 400 firefighters arrived. The second hour after the fire alert was dedicated to reinforcing the firefighting operation. Since the hydrants in the area couldn't handle it, the firefighters parked a boat with a powerful hydraulic pump on the banks of the River Seine, as close as possible to the cathedral, which is located on the Ile de la Cité in the center of Paris. By the time they started pumping enough water to reduce the fire, almost 2 hours had already passed since the beginning of the fire. At 7:50 in the evening, the spire collapsed and the whole world watched that scene live. From this image, you might even doubt it, but just this structure weighed 750 tons. God bless you.
to this day, we keep trying to understand and ask ourselves the question, did the firefighters make a mistake? Couldn't they have used other techniques to fight this gigantic fire? Couldn't they have acted a little faster? Maybe even using those huge helicopters that carry water and drop it over the fire. Why didn't they do that? Actually, no. Those helicopters would have been a tragedy here because the weight of the water falling from above onto the top of the church would have had a devastating effect. Just imagine a structure that's over 8 centuries old, already weighing 750 tons by itself, still receiving more tons on top of that. It would have been a tragedy. The firefighters acted correctly, and there was still another problem here. Just look at all the structures in this church since they're made of stone, very old. If you cool down a stone like this quickly after it's been in the fire, it can crack right away. So they couldn't suddenly cool down the church either.
Another obstacle. They couldn't point the water hoses from the outside in, like you do in a normal fire, where the main thing is to save lives, and it doesn't really matter if you preserve the structure or the objects inside. That wasn't the case here, right? Among the countless treasures stored in Notre-Dame, there was even what tradition says is the crown of thorns that Jesus Christ wore on the day of the crucifixion, as well as a piece of the Holy Cross. It was essential to save the relics, and to reduce the risk of collapse, the firefighters found themselves forced to risk their own lives. They entered the cathedral and poured the water from the inside out. On the front line of fighting the flames, on the main roof, was a 27-year-old CrossFit champion, firefighter Lieutenant Miriam Chudzinski. She already knew the structure from the inside because she had trained there and knew how to move around. But according to her, the heat was so intense, over 500 degrees Celsius, that it was impossible to continue. At that moment, a fireball exploded on the roof, under the spire, and the firefighters only survived because they were behind a wall. Over the radio, Lieutenant received the order to fall back. It was clear that it was no longer possible to save the roof.
There was another serious mistake when they renovated. They redesigned the entire fire protection system at Notre-Dame. They didn't want to install fire doors, the ones that block the spread of fire, so as not to alter the original architecture of the Gothic cathedral. In many churches in Europe, churches here in France, this system works. And if it had been installed here, it would undoubtedly have prevented at least part of the destruction. The tactic now was to reduce the
damage.
To prevent the total collapse of the church.
At the back of the cathedral, above the altar, there are two large towers. One with 2 giant bells and the other with 8 smaller bells, but just as heavy or even heavier. All these bells were also supported by centuries-old wooden beams that were already burning. The wind was blowing north, exactly in the direction of the tower with 8 bells. The collapse was inevitable. If the north tower gave way, it would bring down the south tower as well, and probably the buttresses and walls of Notre Dame wouldn't withstand a shock of that magnitude. The order was to save the towers.
The change in strategy worked, and it was only because of that Notre Dame didn't collapse. But the firefighters still needed another 2 hours to get the fire under control, which was only really put out, completely extinguished.
The next day, those 15 minutes were decisive. At 9:45 p.m., just over 3 hours after it started, the Notre Dame fire was finally brought under control. At 11:30 p.m., President Emmanuel Macron appeared live on TV and said that the worst had been avoided. His promise was to rebuild Notre Dame, but the president asked for contributions. Only with donations would there be enough money to carry out a project of this size.
The very next day, France's billionaires answered the call and began making donations. In less than 24 hours, the equivalent of 4 billion reais had already been donated to start the reconstruction of the church.
The 2 richest families in France, the Arnault family from the Louis Vuitton fashion and beverage empire, and the Bettencourt family from L'Oréal Cosmetics, each donated 200 million euros. To this day, the French have raised about €1 billion, which is more than 5 billion reais. The renovation is being almost entirely funded by these donations. And even with all the structure and resources, the work is enormous, and 5 years have already passed. The promise to reopen Notre Dame in time for the Olympics was not fulfilled. At that moment, with Notre Dame in flames, live, in front of the whole world, the impression was that everything was lost, especially after the spire collapsed. With this tragedy, what would happen to the countless relics and works of art stored over 850 years of history, which had survived even after 2 world wars? And what about the French Revolution? E da Revolução Francesa? One of the pleasant surprises after the dust settled was that almost everything had been saved. Among other relics, the crown of thorns that tradition says was worn by Jesus escaped unharmed and is now kept under lock and key at the Louvre Museum. The tunic of Saint Louis, the saint who was also King Louis IX of France in the 13th century, was also saved. It was Saint Louis himself who brought the crown of thorns of Jesus to Paris, and he was wearing this tunic at the ceremony presenting the relic. 3 large rose windows also survived, which is what these round stained glass windows are called. On the north end is the only rose window that is completely original, still with all the stained glass from the 13th century. In the center, an image of Our Lady holding the baby Jesus, surrounded by 16 prophets. The rose window of the south door, which was restored over the centuries, was also thanks to St. Louis, who commissioned it. It is 13 meters in diameter. The church organ, made of metal, did not melt and only suffered minor damage because of the water that the firefighters had to pour over it. Thank you.